the issue of brainwashing, codependency as a kind of brainwashing response. This will be one for the conspiracy people. Codependents in adult life function as though they were in some sort of cult, a cult which brainwashed them, us.
Defines child mistreatment, child abuse. Alice Miller, Flyer. Humiliations, spankings and beatings, slaps in the face, betrayal, sexual exploitation, derision, neglect, and so on are all forms of mistreatment because they injure the integrity and dignity of a child, even if the consequences are not visible right away. However, as adults, most abused children will suffer and let others suffer from these injuries. This dynamic of violence can deform some victims into hangmen who take revenge even on whole nations and become willing executors to dictators and cruel leaders. Beaten children very early on assimilate the violence they endure, which they may glorify and apply later as parents, in believing that they deserved the punishment and were beaten out of love. They don't know that the only reason for the punishments they had to endure is the fact that their parents themselves endured and learned violence without being able to question it. This is why the society's ignorance remains so immovable, and parents continue to produce severe pain and destructivity in all goodwill in every generation. Most people tolerate this blindly because the origins of human violence in childhood have been and are still being ignored worldwide.
So there's a sort of, I mentioned in the last video about popped bolts, you know, a bolt that is on a plane, that's holding the wing of a plane, it gets stressed, it looks strained, it's a bit scarred up, it's got lines on it, and it needs replacing. When there's actual trauma, though, the bolts are completely popped. That's trauma. That's the difference between stress and trauma. The bolts have actually popped. It's pretty serious. We have to put something in place that binds, that breaks. So there are multiple breaks with codependency, and such is the nature of being raised in cult-like circumstances.
A family unit can be cult-like just the same. The process of brainwashing, psychological coercion, and thought reform. to conjure up coordinated programs of coercive influence and behavioral control using age-old persuasion techniques in order to change people's attitude around a vast array of philosophies, theories, and practices. These masterful manipulators appear to be aware that they need to put into place a packaged set of influence techniques, tactics, and strategies in order to convince others to follow them and go along with their bidding. So, what else does a very manipulative parent? They use the same coercion and manipulation and abuse, shaming, guilt-tripping, gaslighting, devaluation, silent treatment, whatever techniques they have at their disposal. And that over years and years. This will have a profound impact on a child. The key to successful thought reform is to keep the subjects unaware that they are being manipulated and controlled, and especially to keep them unaware that they are being moved along a path of change that will lead them to serve interests that are to their disadvantage. The usual outcome of thought reform process is that a person or group gains almost limitless control over the subjects of varying periods of time. When I asked ordinary people what they think brainwashing is, they correctly grasp that it refers to the exploitative manipulation of one person by another. They usually describe a situation in which a person or group has conned others into going along with a plan put in place by the instigator. A certain type of psychological con game is exactly what goes on in a thought reform environment. A complex set of interlocking factors is put into place, and these factors, either quickly or slowly, depending on the situation and the subject, bring about deep changes in the mindset and attitudes of the targeted individual. Through the manipulation of psychological and social factors, people's attitudes can indeed be changed, and their thinking and behavior radically altered. Historical examples of brainwashing. During the 1930s, purge trials in the former Soviet Union, men and women accused of committing crimes against the state were maneuvered into both falsely confessing to and falsely accusing others of these crimes. The world press expressed bewilderment and amazement at the phenomenon, but with few exceptions soon lapsed into silence.
Technically speaking, I think communism can be best described as feudalism. The communist state was constructed so as to restrict the free movement, free speech and free thought of people, to tie them into a specific location via a series of affiliations. These affiliations were ostensibly to an abstract entity, which was the Communist Party. But in reality, these affiliations were to specific individuals, which were known as nomenclatura. So, communist officials on all levels controlled the lives of mostly agrarian workers and to some extent factory workers. And they controlled their lives to such an extent that these people became virtuous slaves.
Right. The covert anything, covert manipulation, covert bullying, covert operations, covert intelligence gathering, it means it's covered. It means it's under the surface. It means that the predator that is operating while seeking its psychological prey, its emotional prey, the narcissistic supply that the predator is looking for, it's operating under the radar. She happened to live in a country of the former Soviet Union. So we would joke about this, kind of dark humor. We were joking about gulags, running different gulags. And I would say, well, in my gulag, I beat my prisoners and I tell them, I hate you, filthy prisoners, because you're enemies of the Communist Party and you deserve this pain. And every day at 4 o'clock, I hose them down with cold water and then give them a good beating. In her gulag, she does exactly the same thing. She hoses them down with cold water and she beats them with rubber pipes on the feet or whatever, whatever the abusive thing is. But she tells them that she loves them. She tells them that though they're enemies of the Communist Party, they were mistaken, they were confused, and that she loves them and that she wants to accept them back in to the fold, into the warm heart of communist brotherhoodness. Now, you might think this is a silly example, but this actually did happen. The very term brainwashing that we use in English is an anglification and bastardization of a Chinese communist term that I think was either called, I think the word that they use in Chinese implies mind or heart washing, cleansing the heart, that because the word in Chinese will imply heart, mind and spirit, cleansing the heart of impurity, of impure thoughts against the Communist Party. Why is it so much crueler in the gulag, where they are told as they're being beaten that they're in the ministry of love, not in the ministry of torture, as in 1984? Why is that so much crueler? Because if you are allowed to call abuse, if you are allowed to say, yes, I am an anti-communist, beat me all you want, you filthy communist swine, I stand in opposition to you, then your spirit won't be broken. You will know who you are. But if you are told repeatedly over days, months and years with constant exposure that you are not being beaten, that you are not hated, that you are loved, and that this is not torture, I'm not torturing you, I'm not punishing you for being an anti-communist, I love you, I am re-educating you, I am washing your heart, my brother, my sister, my comrade, Tavarish, I am cleansing your mind of these impure, filthy, capitalist thoughts that corrupt you and bind you to the great Satan of, whatever the common enemy is. Covert narcissism operates in exactly the same way. I'm not beating you, I'm loving you. I'm not hurting you, I'm your friend. I'm not the predator, I am the prey. So I need to wrap this up because it's nearly 5 minutes. Where I prey upon you, I am the covert narcissist. I prey upon you. But even as I prey upon you, I am telling you, brainwashing you, propagandizing you into believing that I am not a predator. I am not preying upon you. I am not drinking your milkshake. Even as the straw is in my mouth and I'm slurping away, I'm looking at you and saying, I'm not drinking your milkshake. This is not happening. And not only that, but I am not a predator. I am the prey. I am the victim here. I am the victim. You, in fact, are abusing me. So here's what then happens in this echo chamber of insanity, is you get covert and inverted narcissists accusing people of narcissism even as they are narcissistically consuming them. So it would be like the praying mantis eating the head of another mantis, and even as they're eating that head going, why are you eating my head? Why do you devour me this way, you filthy creature? Even as they are hitting you, they cry out in pain, even as you are struck by the covert narcissist. They hit you and they say ow. They attack you and then they shrink away in terror. What would the effect of this be? So imagine in this crazy gulag that gets even crazier. My gulag, I just beat people and I'm just like, you filthy anti-communist, how could you, I'll force you at gunpoint to kiss this picture of Stalin. But in my client's gulag, in the other gulag, where she tells them she loves them and that this is for their own good and that this is for their own education, What if it went even crazier? What if in her crazy gulag, every time a prison guard beat a prisoner across the feet with that rubber hose, the prison guard said, ow, 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 why are you hurting me? Why are you doing this to me? Now, you might laugh as you think about that, but something like that goes on. It's a very silly, cartoonish, easy to envision example I'm giving you, so that you could see how crazy this is and how crazy making it would be. If indeed this did happen, how much damage would it do to you? How much damage would it do to the victim? Not only are you now suffering, see, covert narcissistic abuse is a different animal. It's a different thing. Overt narcissism is horrible. It's a disgusting thing to experience, overt narcissism. A dirtying, humiliating, spirit-destroying thing. But the covert narcissist makes you doubt your own sanity, because for the first year, 2 years, 3 years of the relationship, you'll be spending most of your time going, are they abusing me or not? Are they a predator or not? Are they the predator or are they the victim? Because you'll notice, clever people that you are becoming, clever people that we are becoming as we get wise to this game, is that they propagandize us with the notion that they are vulnerable. And there is this thing that allegedly borderline people do. Borderline, some people will say, is a form of narcissism, borderline personality disorder, which is of being the vulnerable predator and of being very ostentatiously and pretentiously and theatrically vulnerable right in front of you. Look at how poor and vulnerable and small I am, and delicate and fragile, nom, 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 even as they're, devouring you from within and eviscerating you and eating your guts in front of your eyes. Which, I like using film analogies, brings me back to the idea of the Schmeagol Gollum split character, who is at times the innocent, big-eyed, he's kind of cute in a sort of hairless, toothless, grey-skinned, loincloth-wearing way, and then he switches, and when your guard is down, and you're that pleasant fat hobbit who's going, oh, maybe Schmeagol's not so bad, that's when Gollum comes out and drinks your milkshake and eats your liver while you're asleep. So it's a double-edged sword. Not only are you being narcissistically abused, but you don't know that you're being narcissistically abused, because they are propagandizing you and brainwashing you, mind-washing you, heart-washing you into thinking that they're the victim. Which is why when we go through the traits of covert narcissists, one of the big ones is they have a victim complex, and they're very ostentatiously full on with saying, I am not understood by this cruel world. You don't understand me. Nobody understands me. I'm the biggest victim in the room. So how do you overcome that? Well, you need to learn to see abuse as abuse.
Then, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the world witnessed personnel at Chinese revolutionary universities implement a thought reform program that changed the beliefs and behaviors of the citizens of the largest nation in the world. This program, which Mao Zedong wrote about as early as the 1920s, was put into place when the communist regime took power in China on October 1, 1949. Chairman Mao had long planned how to change people's political selves, to achieve ideological remolding, as he called it, through the use of a coordinated program of psychological, social, and political coercion. As a result, millions of Chinese citizens were induced to espouse new philosophies and exhibit new conduct. The term brainwashing was first introduced into the Western world in 1951, when American foreign correspondent Edward Hunter published a book titled Brainwashed in Red China. Hunter was the first to write about the phenomenon based on his interviews of both Chinese and non-Chinese coming across the border from China into Hong Kong. His translator explained to him that the communist process of ridding people of the vestiges of their old belief system was called colloquially now, which literally means wash brain or cleansing the mind. Brain changing had become a thematic symbol not just for Liang but also for others in the embattled reformist milieu. The 1899 essay Theory of Changing the Brain Essence of the National Citizenry, published in Shanghai by the little-known writer named Li Shiji, connected this goal with the specific idea of washing the brain. The reformers' aim must be to wash away the millennia of dregs and filth from the brain matter of our countrymen and project upon in the model of the modern world. This essay was soon after included in a collection of writings edited by the influential educator and revolutionary Tsai Yuanpei. The following year, the leading intellectual Yan Fu, in his translation of Herbert Spencer's The Study of Sociology, inserted a reference to the need for those who engage in the study of sociology to wash our brains and purify our hearts. January 1903. The new metaphor of washing the brain served well to encapsulate the aim of transforming China into a progressive, powerful, and scientifically modernized state no longer fettered by its traditional ideas. Liang, 1899, speculated about the role of religion, literature, and other factors in achieving this goal. He also remarked on the changes of himself experienced as an exile in Yokohama, reading large amounts of Japanese texts, including translations of Western political classics. This transformed my brain essence, such that my thought and speech, as compared with before, were like those of two different people. In the years to come, a young pre-Marxist Mao Zedong, studying in Hunan, would be influenced by both Liang's writings and the martyred Tan Sitong's The Study of Benevolence. In the 1950s, also brought by Korean War, North Koreans' intensive indoctrination of United Nations prisoners of war showed the world the extent to which captors could go to win converts to their political cause. The Korean program was based on methods used by the Chinese, combined with other social and psychological influence techniques. These extremes of social and psychological manipulations of thought and conduct were, and sometimes still are, disregarded by Americans because the events occurred far away and could be dismissed as merely foreign propaganda and political acts. Such reasoning is a variation of the "not me" myth. Not in our land could such a thing happen. But later, certain events occurred in California that forced many to see that extremes of influence and manipulation were possible in the United States too. This series of events from 1930s to the present demonstrates that individual autonomy and personal identity are much more fragile than was once commonly believed, and that certain venal types have gotten hold of and perfected techniques of persuasion that are wreaking havoc in our society. Were George Orwell alive, he might be intrigued with the variety of situations in which mind-bending and thought-manipulating techniques are applied today. Interestingly enough, Orwell was perhaps the first to note that language, not physical force, is the key to manipulating minds. How cult leaders and other clever operators get people to do their bidding seems arcane and mysterious to most persons, but I find there is nothing esoteric about it at all. There are no secret drugs or potions. It is just words and group pressures put together in packaged forms. Modern-day manipulators use methods of persuasion employed since the days of the cavemen, but the masterful con artists of today have hit upon a way to put the techniques together in packages that are especially successful. As a result, thought reform as a form of influence and persuasion falls on the extreme end of continuum that also includes education as we typically see it, advertising, propaganda, and indoctrination.
What a great way to brainwash somebody, get them in childhood where they have no ego boundaries, they can't say no. Their brain is at its most plastic, your neuroplasticity is at its highest. All authority figures are listened to because of this. When you're inside of a cult, whether it's an actual cult or a narcissistic family unit that simply functions like a cult, any ego boundaries that you try to form will be smashed down at first sight. And you will be told that obedience is a virtue. So your superego, which is there, as I said, as a GPS system to allow us to live in accordance with our values and to move towards that which is good for us and away from danger. It creates a new value system. And in this new value system, it says obedience is the most virtuous thing. To annihilate yourself and to be the best servant, the best slave you can possibly be, is the best thing. Governments do this. It was literally done in Soviet Russia. They said they released propaganda saying about some young gentleman who apparently worked extremely hard as a farmer and put 18 bales of hay together in a day where everybody else was only doing 3 or something like that. So a standard is set very, very high. The superego will do this if you're raised in a narcissistic culture, a narcissistic family environment. The narcissistic family environment is the microcosmic level, the narcissistic culture is the macrocosmic level. And so you'll always be given a higher standard to aspire to. These higher standards are usually completely inhumane and totally unrealistic, but that's the cleverness of them. Get you when you're young, get you when you have no ego boundaries, and make you aspire to almost impossible to achieve high standards to keep you working. So that's what codependents do. We work, we work, we work. We find things to do. We fix things. We are fixers. We are pleasers. So you are set with a coordinate from an early age that obedience is a virtue, and service is a virtue, slavery is a virtue. And another thing that occurs in this brainwashing process is that we are burdened with enormous feelings of guilt. Because if you want to get the child to do something, you can terrify the child and it will work. Far more powerful, far more long-lasting to guilt and shame the child into submission. That goes straight to the superego. If you just terrify the child and bully the child, you may be designated as a bad, threatening, undesirable, dangerous object, foreign object, separate from me. But if the parent uses guilt and shame, the child is far more likely to internalize that guilt and shame.
The Science of Shame by Gerald Loren Fishkin, PhD. Research has shown that shame proneness seems to have trauma-like origins in negative rearing experiences, namely experiences of shaming, abandonment, rejection, emotional negligence, or emotional control, and several forms of abusive, critical, and/or harsh parental styles. Shame is a reaction. In my clinical experience with patients who experience chronic and sometimes debilitating shame core manifestations, a patient's history reveals the etiology of early life emotional deprivation from absent, abusive, or neglectful parents or caregivers. These individuals' fractured emotional relationships, self-condemnation, and inhibitions reveal deficits in attunement, intimacy, and compassion, especially for oneself. Shame and anger. Clinically, shame and anger are actually very closely related. Anger is manifested in many different ways. Very often, therapists may miss essential cues regarding the need to address core issues associated with toxic shame and deal only with the more objective symptoms or personality issues. For example, patients with chronic alcohol or drug addiction may not even present their deeper issues associated with shame, and treatment may address only the cessation of their chemical dependency or abuse.
Dr. Jerry Fishkin. Why is he on the show? Well, because he is very important in the realm of shame. He's an expert.
My interest in shame really started somewhere around 5 years ago when I was introduced to John Bradshaw and Pia Melody and Claudia Black, who were thought leaders in the area of addiction and trauma.
Apperception. The notion of apperception is found in the early psychologies of Herbert Spencer, Hermann Lotze, and Wilhelm Wundt in 1800s. Its original meaning was associated with conscious awareness, that is, to perceive, in other words, sensations, can break through the limen or threshold into conscious awareness. In the context of the therapeutic treatment of shame, apperception refers to conscious perception with full awareness, that is, the state of the mind being conscious of its own consciousness. Apperception is the process of understanding by which newly observed or experienced qualities of ourself are integrated into our associations of past experiences. Most important is the idea that we can communicate or check in with ourself. This is a reality that we can use in evaluating our own experiences, a way of self-validation. Pia Melody's shame reduction treatment approach. For Melody, early life trauma, abuse and neglect are the predetermining factors associated with codependence. Her treatment model appears to have this goal for the patient: to become more trusting of one's own intuition through becoming the patient's own healthy parent model, as well as the repairing of childhood trauma reactions, leading to a healthy adult state. Melody's treatment approach focuses on shifting the patients from an inhibitory shutdown state of shame into the vitality state of assertion and self-care. How is this accomplished? According to her model, through reparenting their self, they take charge of their own wounding and repair. It's through the release of affective energy. Thus, they take responsibility for their life in the present, moving toward the future. The model stresses that patients must learn to accept the fact that they are not perfect and that perfection is not possible or realistic goal to achieve. That is, they must learn to accept their perfectly imperfect self. The goal of Melody's model is to become a more functional adult, one who is able to display righteous anger that releases the effects and allows for healthy, self-assertive behavior to develop.
When I began to go through certain programs at the Meadows to find out what they knew about shame, I realized that there wasn't really a lot of information. It was more anecdotal and contemporaneous than science. So I started a pursuit to understand what this thing called shame was. I began to realize that in my own clinical practice, when I'm dealing with addicts or people who have addictive disorders and we get to a certain place with regard to early life abuse, trauma, neglect, violence, they would either freeze or bolt from treatment and they would never finish the therapy. So I wanted to understand what this process was that caused them to leave. And as I did my reading and pursuing this shame issue, I got to see that shame really lives in the brain, and it lives in the basal ganglia of the brain. Again, bringing back all my early neuropsych work.
The basal ganglia, also known as the basal nuclei. Now, first thing you need to be aware of is when it comes to movement, it initiates, at least voluntary movement, will initiate from the motor cortex. Now, the motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe, and if, as an example, I want to tell my legs to move so I can walk, I send a signal from my motor cortex down to my spinal cord. It synapses or speaks to the next neuron, which goes out of my spinal cord to the muscles in my legs to tell them to contract. So that means, for movement, it's a 2-neuron chain descending from the brain, made up of an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Now, this isn't the whole story because we need to modulate this movement. So, for example, we need to send a signal that can help us initiate a movement and smooth the movement out. And we also need to send a signal that can help modulate the movement by allowing us to maintain balance, posture, and muscle tone. Okay? So, in addition to the upper and lower motor neuron, these modulatory pathways include that of the basal ganglia deep in the brain, and also the cerebellum, which is the small brain located at the back and below the brain. The basal ganglia helps us initiate and smooth out motor movement, and the cerebellum helps us maintain muscle tone, balance, and stability. Then if we go down to the medulla, you'll see an important component called the substantia nigra, which means black substance. These are neurons, or a group of neurons that produce dopamine. Very important in motor movement. All right. you can see that when we want to move, or at least when we want the basal ganglia to help us initiate motor movement and smooth motor movement out, there's complex neural circuitry that's happening. Simply put, you've got a direct pathway and an indirect pathway firing off in these different regions. When we look at the direct pathway, it's a signal that goes from the motor cortex, and this signal is starting off saying, as an example, I want my legs to move so I can walk. From the direct pathway is, I want to move my legs? Yes, you can. Okay. Now, there's also an indirect pathway which goes from the motor cortex, again to the striatum, this time from the striatum to the globus pallidus externa, then to the subthalamic nuclei, and then back to the globus pallidus interna. So it can go back through this pathway. This is an inhibitory signal. So the indirect pathway starts off with, can I move my legs? And the outcome is, no, you cannot. So you've got the direct pathway which is saying, go, 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 and the indirect pathway which is saying, stop, stop, stop. So what's happening here? How come when I go to walk, I'm not doing this? Or if I want to move my hands, I'm not having this resting tremor? How do I initiate this movement? And how do I smooth this movement out? Well, this is where the substantia nigra comes in, and this is where these neurons that produce dopamine come into play. For example, some of these neurons project out to the direct pathway and excite it. So dopamine excites the already excitatory pathway. So it reinforces the direct pathway which says, yes, let's move. And you can initiate that movement. However, remember you've got the inhibitory pathway which is trying to stop that movement. So dopaminergic neurons which are projecting out from the substantia nigra are going to the indirect pathway and are inhibiting it. So remember, the indirect pathway was an inhibitory pathway. So now dopamine is inhibiting an inhibitory pathway. So if you're inhibiting it, it's not going to now tell the direct pathway to stop. So now what we have is we can initiate motor movement and we've smoothed motor movement out so we don't get this resting tremor. In Parkinson's disease, these dopaminergic neurons projecting from the substantia nigra to the striatum are dying off.
The individual truly understands that they are not responsible for those early traumas, that those traumas were inflicted upon them. It's really the opening the door of self-acceptance. When we can really what I call pin the tail on the donkey and really assign blame and responsibility to the other, then my patients really begin to feel as though they can own their new healthy life and begin to take chances and risks with new behaviors and become a bit more self-promotional, if you will, or advocating for themselves.
This is from a study, The Sense of Agency, a measure of consciously perceived control over one's mind, body, and the immediate environment. A person's general context-free beliefs about having core agency. The last few years have seen a resurge of interest in this topic, driven mostly but not solely by the neurosciences, which largely focused on the precursors of the sense of agency. I am in full control of what I do. My behavior is planned by me from the very beginning to the very end. In somatic experience, the sense of agency is taken very seriously. Your sense of agency. Are you in control of your life? Your ability to take action, be effective, influence your own life, and assume responsibility for your behavior are important elements of what you bring to a relationship. The sense of agency is essential for you to feel in control of your life, to believe in your capacity to influence your own thoughts and behavior, and have faith in your ability to handle a wide range of tasks or situations. Having a sense of agency influences your stability as a separate person. It is your capacity to be psychologically stable, yet resilient or flexible in the face of conflict or change.
Or asserting themselves in different ways. And that's what I see in treatment. They've become less inhibited, less confined by their own self-talk and their own feelings of inadequacy and their own feelings of disgust and despair. When we can get them to understand that it's not their fault, if you will. You know, and that there's and I think I may have mentioned this on an earlier show, that there's a scene in Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams puts his arms around Matt Damon and says to Matt, it's a very emotional scene where he says, it's not your fault. I mean, any of us who have seen that scene or seen it over and over get it. We get the fact that those words are so profound. It's not your fault. Then we can begin to deal with what I call, developing a better sense of self, and I think that is critically important to the whole therapeutic process. Sure.
The science of shame. Shame is the ghost in the machine of the human mind. It can implant itself in the psyche before the first word is spoken, even before the first thought has formed. In this groundbreaking book, The Science of Shame and Its Treatment, psychotherapist and author Gerald Lauren Fishkin, PhD, addresses the genesis of shame and self-talk from an empirical analysis of their core elements, its insidious ingress into conscious thought, and the havoc it inflicts on a person's self-worth and behavior. Through his empirical analysis and understanding of toxic shame, Dr. Fishkin has identified multiple effective clinical approaches for its treatment and addressing shame-based behaviors. He clearly outlines why contemporary treatment approaches, including cognitive behavioral therapy, do not treat core shame wounds and most often cause individuals to terminate the therapeutic process prematurely.
Dr. Antonio Damasio at SC and his team of neuroscientists actually were the first to pinpoint that shame lives in the brain in the basal ganglia, which is just above the limbic system, the seat of emotion. And as I began to pursue this, I found that it really kind of had a dead end. And I wanted to understand this as a personality theorist and a neuropsychologist. I kind of felt that there is meat here, and I got to find out where the bone is. So as I continue to pursue this, I found that self-talk, which is really the part of shame that we hear, and then the affective part of shame played such a critical role, but nobody had really written about it. So as I began to pursue the literature, not only in the United States, but across the pond into Europe and such, I saw that nobody had really done a lot of this. Again, anecdotal, contemporaneous information. I began to see the relevance of the neuropsych stuff, the neurology, and the perceptual and cognitive pieces here with shame. I saw that cognition plays no part in shame. Actually, shame is an affect. And as I started to look at affects, nobody had really talked about affects. They only talked about affects and generalizations. So that is really where I began this process. In fact, the first few drafts of my book were called Self-Talk and the Architecture of Shame. And as I began to develop this and look at it, put all the pieces together, I actually realized that I had a science here more than just a collection of data and pieces. It actually shows the science of shame in terms of where it is located in the brain, how it operates on us, and how we can actually deal with it. But more important, I began to understand that our traditional ways of dealing with shame, including cognitive behavioral therapy, did not work. And that's why my patients were bolting at a certain point in therapy.
So for the layman, how do you explain, because a lot of people don't know what CBT is and how shame relates to it or not. So just for the person on the street, how would you define that for them so they can understand their own therapy?
Sure. Shame, when we have a shame attack, and let me just kind of back up. Folks that have early life trauma, neglect, abuse, violence, anything that's destabilizing and considered abuse, as they grow and mature, the shame factors tend to expand and tend to control the individual's life in terms of self-talk. Individuals who suffer from chronic toxic shame with addictions often never really feel good about themselves. They absolutely suffer what I consider to be the 10 greatest fears that a person can have. Those being fear of being abandoned, not being good enough, going crazy, losing relationships, being a failure, fear of being a failure, fear of the emptiness that many people with toxic shame experience. More important, displeasing someone, being seen as a phony, not mattering. I think not mattering is huge. And then, of course, being shamed. So these issues with the person who suffers toxic shame are paramount, and that's what they hear. When we use cognitive behavioral therapy works with cognitions that cause a person to feel bad about themselves. Those are the cognitions. But affects and toxic shame really is precognitive. It functions at a very basal level. And there is no pre-warning when we have a shame attack. It just happens to us. As with cognitive behavioral therapy, we could certainly take our time and deal with how a person thinks about an activating event, and then their belief about that event, and then the consequential behavior or thought. That's cognitive behavioral therapy. It works at a much higher level of the brain, whereas with toxic shame, it works at a very basal level of the shame.